What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back. And you know something, folks? Summertime is supposed to be a time in this hobby where the Pokemon TCG cools off a little bit. But not this summer. Not the summer of 2025. The market is absolutely on fire as we have seen some insane new record prices this week yet again. Folks, in this week's recap, if the card had a Pikachu on it, it was probably hitting a new record price. And we also saw a PSA 10 Shadowless base set Charizard come by, along with a CGC 10 Trophy Kangaskhan that hit a pretty impressive price. So please, folks, stay tuned to the very end. You are not going to want to miss today's recap. Folks, before I get into today's unprecedented recap, I wanted to encourage you to go check out the 100% Pokemon card auction block happening this Sunday, July 13th on fanaticscollect.com. There you will find extremely scarce and very desirable PSA, Beckett, and CGC graded cards. Many of these cards, folks, are insane vintage grails. As you can see on the screen, folks, I put a preview of what's up for grabs. Certainly no shortage of variety here, folks. A link to this auction block will be in the description of this video. Please support the channel, go check it out, and let me know what you pick up. Alright folks, let's get into today's recap, starting off with the newest cards from the Japanese black and white sets that have just come out. The Zekrom and Reshiram Special Art Rare cards in PSA 10, both sold this week for $490. And these are pretty stellar illustrations, if you ask me. It makes me pretty excited for the upcoming English versions of these cards. And then up next, folks, I want to talk about several modern cards that have been doing phenomenally well just this past week. Here is a Mew EX SIR from Paldean Fates that sold as a PSA 10 this week for $1,100. Here, folks, is a new record price for the Magikarp and Wailord GX Alt Art from Team Up, in which it sold for $3,050 in auction as a PSA 10. Along with this guy right here, it is a PSA 6 Latios GX, also from Team Up, that sold for $1,575, while the PSA 10 copy sold this week for a staggering $8,300. Yeah. And then we saw more record-breaking sales in this Gengar Mimikyu GX, also from Team Up. Here's a PSA 10 that sold for $4,750. The other one here sold for $4,900. Yes, that is a new record price for this card. Here we have the Special Delivery Bidoof. These Special Delivery cards have been through the roof lately, especially as PSA 10s. This copy here sold for $2,605. And then, folks, I kind of covered this earlier this week when I did a video about it. It is the Full Art Pikachu from Celebrations, sold as a PSA 10 this week for $610. Speaking of Pikachu, we got a lot of Pikachus to cover. Here is the Special Delivery Pikachu, sold as a PSA 10 for $1,706. Here is the Pikachu Scream promo that sold as a PSA 10 for $6,500. And then the PSA 10 Pikachu Van Gogh promos have been selling very consistently this week for over $1,000 in auction. Here's a sale for $1,125. Here's a sale for $1,016. Another one for $1,275. And then we did see a CGC 10 Pristine copy come by, and it sold for $1,182. And then here is a lot of 10 Pikachu Van Gogh sealed promos that sold for $4,250 this week. And then we saw a bunch of the poncho-wearing Pikachus hitting some insane prices this week. Here is a Magikarp poncho-wearing Pikachu that sold for $8,700. Here's a PSA 10 Gary poncho-wearing Pikachu that sold for a record price of $9,300, while the Black Label copy of this card sold for $22,400. And then we saw the Mario Pikachu and Luigi Pikachu cards come by. Here's a full art Luigi Pikachu in PSA 10 that sold for $9,200. And then here we saw both the Luigi Pikachu cards in PSA 10 that were also both signed with sequential PSA cert numbers, sold for $20,700. Here, folks, is a raw copy of the full art Mario Pikachu, sold for $7,600 this week, while a PSA 10 sold for a record-breaking price of $14,900. And we also saw a Tag 10 copy of this card sell for $13,100. And then lastly, for our modern cards, we have this 2015 Japanese XY Promo Art Academy Pikachu that sold as a PSA 10 for $16,100. Getting into the vintage portion of our video, we have this complete collection of base 2 cards. These should all be near mint copies that sold for a total of $1,792. Here's the complete set of first edition Fossil cards that sold for $1,853, and then the complete set of first edition Team Rocket cards sold for $2,452. A couple of base set cards came by. Here is a CGC 10 Pristine Black Flame Ninetales card that sold for $2,201, while the PSA 10 First Edition Ninetales from base set sold for $8,555. Here we have a First Edition Poliwrath from base set that sold for $5,988, while this First Edition Hitmonchan sold for $9,322. Here is a Japanese no rarity symbol Nidoking, sold as a PSA 10 for $11,633. And then here, folks, is a raw copy of the first edition base set Charizard. Looked very, very minty and sold for $17,100. I was looking at this card, folks, and it does look very clean on the front and the back. Here we have a CGC9 test print Charizard with a Venusaur backing on it that sold for $8,185 this week. And then here is a not so good auction. It is a fake base set booster box that sold for $12,200. So, I mean, the unlimited base set booster boxes have been going for closer to $30,000 when they are authentic, but this one here is not. So I hope that this wasn't a legit sale and someone didn't just get gypped out of over $12,000. Up next, we have the more expensive cards from First Edition Fossil. Here is a Lapras in PSA 10, sold for $4,481. Here is a pre-release Aerodactyl that also got a first edition stamp and sold for $1,842. Here's a first edition Articuno that sold for $4,107. The first edition Dragonite sold for $6,201. And the first edition Gengar, which as of now is the most expensive card from Fossil, sold for $8,600 this week. A couple of cards from Team Rocket. Here's a first edition Dark Blastoise, sold for $4,209, while the first edition Dark Charizard sold for $6,110. Here we have a no holo Dark Dragonite in PSA 10 from Team Rocket set that sold for $5,100. From the Neo series, we saw this PSA 9 first edition Lugia sell for $4,650, while this PSA 10 first edition Feraligatr number 5 card sold for $9,588 this week. And then we saw a new record price of the first edition Shining Gyarados from Neo Revelation, sold this week for $16,100. Woo, man! Here from Neo Destiny was this PSA 9 first edition Dark Gengar that sold for $3,200 this week. Here's a PSA 10 reverse holo Squirtle from Legendary Collection, sold for $3,150. And then here, folks, this was actually about a week and a half ago. It is the complete 2002 McDonald's promo cards, all in PSA 10, that sold for $8,600, which is pretty awesome considering the Squirtle alone in PSA 10 sold this week for $3,250. A couple of interesting E-Series cards. Here is a holo Articuno from Skyridge, sold as a PSA 10 for $2,025. Here's the Feraligatr from Expedition that sold for $2,987. I am absolutely in love with this card. From EX Team Rocket Returns, we have this Rockets Entei EX that sold as a PSA 10 for $2,625. And then we saw the Rockets Mewtwo EX also hitting a new record price, selling as a PSA 10 for $8,200. Man, oh man. From Call of Legends, we saw this Suicune sold as a PSA 10 for $3,410. Here is a raw copy of the Level X Snorlax that sold for $916, and we actually have a bunch of PSA 10 Level X cards coming through that we will cover on next week's recap. I am very excited for that because you know I love me some Level X cards. And then here we have a raw copy of the Gold Star Espeon that looked just about as minty as the first edition base set Zard, and this card sold for $11,387. onto the Fanatics Collect Weekly auction block, we have this Charizard Holo from Black and White Legendary Treasures that sold for what I believe might be a new record price of $2,130. Here is a Mega Gengar EX from Phantom Forces, sold as a PSA 10 for $5,040. Here's a first edition Shining Magikarp from Neo Revelation, sold for $5,640. Here is a Black Label Charizard V Japanese HR Contest winner card that sold for $6,300 this week. Here is a Japanese No Rarity Symbol base set Pikachu, sold as a PSA 10 for $8,100. Here is the Charizard Holo from EX Crystal Guardians that sold for possibly a new record price. I'm going to look it up here for $8,100 as a PSA 10. Here's a first edition Shining Tyranitar from Neo Destiny that sold for $9,900. A Japanese Crystal Lugia that sold for $9,900 as well. Here is an SGC Japanese Vending Gengar that sold for $10,200. Here is a PSA 10 Staff Evolutions pre-release Charizard that sold for $10,800 this week. Here is another Luigi Pikachu. This one sold as a PSA 10 for $10,800. Here we have a first edition Sabrina's Gengar from Gym Heroes, sold for $11,100, along with this first edition Pichu from Neo Genesis that sold for an even $12K. Here we have a Holo Umbreon from Skyridge that sold for $12,600. Here's a Japanese Crystal Charizard that sold for $17,400. And then we saw both of the Rayquaza poncho-wearing Pikachus in PSA 10 that sold for $17,400. And then just a couple of cards from alt auctions. Here's a first edition Blaine's Moltres that sold for $3,738. Here is a Techno Flareon from the Topps Chrome series that sold for $4,040. Here we have a 2002 Japanese promo Battle Road Trainer card that sold for $11,400. Along with this 2009 National Championships Wonder Platinum card that sold as a PSA 10 for $51,000. And then the final two cards on this week's recap, we have a PSA 10 Shadowless base set Charizard that sold this week for $54,655. And what's crazy, folks, is this really isn't even that great of a price for this card compared to what we've seen it sell for historically. This card has sold for over six figures at one time. And then the auction of the week, we're going to have to give to this CGC10 Trophy Kangaskhan that sold on eBay for $66,500. Folks, what do you think of this crazy market right now? It's on fire, isn't it? Let me know what you thought of these auctions in the comments below. I look forward to hearing from you. That's all I got for you today. I will catch you all on my next one.